somewhere beneath the sun-baked earth of what is now Iraq, in a land, the ancient world, called the cradle of civilization, a person once lay awake in the dark, one hand pressed against the side of their jaw, waiting for the pain to pass. They did not have the medicine we have today. They did not have the words we have today. But they had something else. They had stories. They had gods. They had healers who whispered incantations into the night. And they had a strange and haunting belief that inside every aching tooth there lived a tiny worm, gnawing away at the root, feeding on blood and pain. Tonight, we travel back more than 4,000 years into the flickering lamplit homes of ancient Mesopotamia to discover exactly how these people, our distant ancestors, endured one of the oldest and most universal forms of human suffering, the toothache. This is a long journey through history, through myth, through medicine, and through the quiet endurance of ordinary people just like you and me. There is no need to remember every detail. There is no need to stay alert. You are simply here to listen, to drift, and to let the ancient world carry you gently toward sleep. So settle into your bed, dim the lights if you haven't already, let your body sink into the mattress, and allow your mind to soften. Over the next 4 hours, we will wander together through the ruins of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria, through clay tablets and temple rituals, through the hands of priests and the whispers of worried mothers, all searching for relief from the same small, sharp pain that still visits us today. If your eyes grow heavy, let them close. If your thoughts begin to blur, let them blur. This story will still be here, wrapped around you like a warm and ancient blanket, whether you are awake to hear every word or drifting somewhere far beyond it. Let's begin. Before we can understand how the Mesopotamians treated their toothaches, we must first understand how they saw pain itself, because the ancient mind did not separate the body from the unseen world the way we so often do today. In the valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in the world's first cities of Ur, Uruk, Nippur, and later Babylon and Nineveh, the people believed that nothing happened by accident. If a crop failed, a god was displeased. If a river flooded, a god was angry. And if a tooth began to throb in the dead of night, stealing sleep and turning simple meals into agony, something was happening beneath the surface of the visible world, something small, something hidden, something alive. The most enduring belief, one that would travel across centuries and even across cultures far beyond Mesopotamia, was the idea of the tooth worm. Imagine for a moment being a farmer or a potter or a mother of 3 children in the city of Ur, around the year 2000 BCE. You wake in the night because a searing pain has bloomed along your jaw. There is no dentist to call. There is no pain reliever in a cabinet. Your world is one of mud brick homes, clay tablets, oil lamps, and the distant sound of the river. What do? You do what everyone around you has always done. You accept almost immediately that a tiny worm has burrowed into your tooth and it is chewing. This belief was not some fringe superstition whispered only by the uneducated. It was written down carefully, deliberately by scribes trained in cuneiform script, pressed into wet clay with a rheostat, then baked or dried in the sun to preserve it for what would become thousands of years. One of the most famous pieces of medical literature to survive from ancient Mesopotamia is a text now known to modern scholars as the Legend of the Worm, sometimes called the Toothache Text. It reads almost like a myth, almost like a bedtime story of its own, one that Mesopotamian healers likely recited aloud as part of a ritual to treat the sufferer. The story goes something like this. After the god Anu created the heavens created the earth created the rivers created the canals created the marsh, and the marsh created the worm. The worm went before the sun god Shamash weeping, and before the god In said, "What will you give me to eat? What will you give me to drink?" And the gods offered the worm ripe figs and apricot juice, but the worm refused. Instead, the worm said, "Let me drink among the teeth, and let me dwell in the gums, and I will suck the blood of the tooth, and gnaw its." This was not simply a scary story to frighten children. It was, in its own way, an explanation, a way of making sense of an invisible, unbearable pain using the tools available at the time, myth, gods, and the natural world. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of your own room, to consider how strange and yet how understandable this belief truly was. Toothaches are, even by modern standards, one of the most disorienting kinds of pain a human body can produce. The nerve endings inside a tooth are incredibly dense, packed into a tiny space, and when they become irritated, whether by decay, infection, or abscess, the resulting sensation can feel like something alive is moving inside you. Add to this the complete absence of any understanding of bacteria, of nerves, of cavities forming from sugar and starch trapped between teeth, and it becomes almost inevitable that ancient peoples would imagine a small creature responsible. After all, worms were something they understood. Worms lived in soil, in rotting wood, in spoiled meat. If something could hollow out a piece of fruit from the inside, surely something similar could hollow out a tooth. The metaphor made sense. It gave shape to an otherwise formless agony. Now imagine that same suffering farmer from Ur, lying awake, believing wholeheartedly that a worm is the cause of the pain. What happens next? In the morning, or perhaps even in the middle of the night, if the pain is severe enough, the family sends for a healer. In Mesopotamian society, there were, broadly speaking, two kinds of medical practitioners, and understanding the difference between them helps us understand just how seriously they treated the mouth and its ailments. The first was called the ashipu. This was a healer who worked with what we might recognize today as practical medicine, herbal remedies, poultices, physical treatments, something closer to what we would call a physician. The second was called the ashipu. This practitioner was more like an exorcist, a priest, a magician, someone who dealt with the world of spirits, curses, and divine displeasure. And here is what is fascinating. In the case of a toothache, both kinds of healers might be involved, sometimes even at the same time, because the Mesopotamians did not see medicine and magic as opposites. They saw them as two tools in the very same toolbox used together to fight the same enemy, whether that enemy was a worm, a demon, or a punishment from a neglected god. Let us imagine in detail what a visit from an ashipu might have looked like in a modest Sumerian home, perhaps in the city of Nippur, a place known for its temples and its devotion to the god Enlil. The sun would have just set, the mud brick walls of the house still radiating the day's heat. The family gathered nervously around a suffering relative. The ashipu arrives, carrying with him small clay implements, dried herbs, and perhaps a portable brazier for burning incense. His first task is not medical in the way we understand it. His first task is diagnostic in a spiritual sense. He must determine why the gods have allowed this suffering to occur. Has the sick person broken a taboo? Have they eaten something forbidden? Have they failed to make an offering? Has an enemy cursed them through sorcery? The ashipu might recite prayers, examine the position of oil dropped into water, or consult small clay models of livers, since liver divination, known as extispicy, was a major part of Mesopotamian religious practice. Once a cause was suspected, the ritual to expel the toothworm could begin. The incantation itself, the one recorded on that ancient tablet we spoke of earlier, was not simply read aloud like a story. It was performed as part of a ceremony meant to trap and destroy the worm. The healer might apply a paste made of beer, a plant called sadanu, and oil directly onto the aching tooth, all while reciting the myth of the worm's creation and its rejection of figs in favor of blood and gums. The words themselves were believed to hold power. To speak the worm's origin story aloud, in the presence of the sacred names of the gods, was thought to weaken the creature's hold on the body, almost as if speaking its history stripped away its power to remain unseen and unnamed. In many ways, this mirrors something psychologically profound that persists even now. The idea that naming a fear, giving it a shape and a story, can make it feel more manageable, less overwhelming. The suffering person's family, gathered around by lamplight, would have felt a measure of comfort simply in knowing that something was being done, that the invisible enemy inside the tooth had been identified and was now being confronted with the full weight of religious tradition. But belief in spirits and worms did not mean the Mesopotamians ignored physical remedies. Quite the opposite. Their medical texts, preserved across hundreds of clay tablets recovered from sites like Nineveh's Great Library, assembled under the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal centuries later, reveal a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of practical treatment, built from centuries of trial, error, and inherited knowledge passed from healer to healer. generation to generation. Let us walk slowly and gently through what these remedies might have actually involved, because this is where the story shifts from myth to something closer to the lived, tactile experience of ancient daily life. One of the most common approaches was the use of plant-based pastes and poultices applied directly to the aching tooth or gum. Mesopotamian pharmacology, if we can call it that, relied heavily on what grew around them, in the fertile floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates, in their carefully tended gardens, and in goods brought by traders from neighboring lands. Henbane, a plant known today for its mildly narcotic and analgesic properties, appears repeatedly in ancient Near Eastern medical texts as a treatment for tooth pain. The seeds of henbane could be crushed, mixed with other substances, and either applied directly to the tooth or, in some remarkable accounts, burned so that the sufferer could inhale the smoke through a funnel or hollow reed placed near the mouth, allowing the fumes to settle around the aching area. We can imagine this scene vividly: a person sitting cross-legged on a woven mat inside a dim mud brick home, a small clay bowl of smoldering henbane seeds before them, a reed tube guiding the pale smoke toward their swollen cheek, the acrid scent filling the small room while family members watched quietly, hoping for relief to come. Other remedies involved substances we might find surprising, even unsettling, by modern standards, though we should remember that these treatments emerged from genuine observation and desperate care rather than cruelty or ignorance. Beer, a staple of Mesopotamian daily life and one of the most important products of their agricultural society, appears constantly in medical texts, not merely as a pleasant drink but as a base for medicines, a way of dissolving and delivering other ingredients into the body. A paste for a toothache might combine beer with oil, with certain ground plants, sometimes with dates, and sometimes with minerals like salt, all mixed together and packed against the offending tooth. Salt, in particular, had a genuine, observable effect that the Mesopotamians would have noticed even without understanding the underlying chemistry. Its ability to draw out fluid, to soothe swollen and inflamed gum tissue, an effect that people across many ancient cultures independently discovered and continued to use for thousands of years afterward. Even today, a warm salt water rinse remains one of the most commonly recommended home remedies for dental pain, a quiet thread connecting our modern nightly routines to the same instinctive wisdom developed in the reed-lined homes of ancient Sumer. There is something deeply moving about this connection, this quiet inheritance passed down not through instruction manuals or scientific journals, but through generations of ordinary people simply trying to ease each other's suffering. A mother in ancient Ur, mixing salt into warm water for her child's aching mouth, was performing an act that a mother in Babylon might repeat centuries later, that a mother in Assyria might repeat centuries after that, each one unaware of the deep river of shared human experience they were quietly participating in. Pain, it turns out, is one of the great connective threads of history, and the impulse to soothe it, to sit beside someone in the dark and offer whatever comfort is available, is perhaps even older than civilization itself. As you continue to rest here, let your mind settle into the rhythm of this ancient world, the slow work of clay tablets and healing pastes, the murmured incantations against invisible worms, the quiet devotion of families tending to each other through pain that had no name beyond the myths they told to explain it. We are only beginning our journey through this vast and ancient history, and there is much more still to uncover: the role of temples and priests in dental suffering, the surprising archaeological evidence of actual dental interventions, the remedies passed along Mesopotamia's great trade routes, and the slow, halting steps toward something resembling real dental science. But for now, let the weight of your day dissolve into this warm and distant past. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts blur gently at the edges, and know that you do not need to hold on to every detail. The ancient world will still be here, patient and unhurried, whenever you drift back to it. Let us walk now into the sacred heart of the ancient Mesopotamian city, into the towering shadow of the ziggurat, the great step temple that rose above every settlement along the Tigris and Euphrates like a mountain built by human hands to reach toward the heavens. Because to truly understand how these ancient people dealt with the pain of a toothache, we must understand the world they lived in, a world where the temple was not simply a place of worship on certain days, but the very center of civic, economic, and medical life every single day, from birth until death. If a person in Nippur or Uruk suffered from a persistent gnawing toothache, one that no household remedy could calm, the natural next step was not a visit to a separate medical clinic the way we might imagine today, but a journey toward the temple complex itself, toward the priests who serve the gods and who, in doing so, serve the health of the people as well. Picture this scene with me, slowly, gently, as if you were walking through it yourself in a half-dream. The city of Ur, sometime around 2100 BCE, during the height of its power under King Ur-Nammu. The streets are narrow, packed dirt, winding between mud brick homes with flat rooftops where families sleep during the hottest nights of summer. The great ziggurat of Ur rises above everything else, layered like a mountain, its baked brick facade the color of warm honey in the afternoon sun. A person suffering from days of tooth pain, swelling along the jaw, fever beginning to creep into the body, is helped by family members through these streets, moving slowly, wincing with each step, until they reach the outer courtyard of the temple complex. Here, priests known as the ashipu, whom we spoke about earlier, would receive them, not with cold clinical detachment, but with the solemn seriousness of men who believe they were quite literally negotiating with unseen forces on behalf of a suffering human being. The Mesopotamian understanding of illness was deeply relational. This is an important idea to sit with for a moment, because it shapes everything about how they approached dental pain. In our modern world, we tend to see illness as something happening within the isolated boundaries of a single body, caused by bacteria, viruses, or physical decay, something we might visualize under a microscope. But for the ancient Mesopotamians, illness existed within a web of relationships, between the sufferer and the gods, between the sufferer and their ancestors, between the sufferer and their community, even between the sufferer and their own past actions and unspoken sins. A toothache, then, was never merely a toothache. It was a message, a symptom of some deeper imbalance that needed to be diagnosed, addressed, and corrected through ritual as much as through physical treatment. The priests of this period developed detailed diagnostic and prognostic texts to help them understand illness, some of which survive today in a monumental work modern scholars call the Diagnostic Handbook, compiled by a scholar named Esagilkin Aptly sometime around 1050 BCE, drawing on centuries of accumulated medical tradition that stretched back long before his own lifetime. Within this vast collection of clay tablets arranged carefully by the part of the body affected, we find detailed entries addressing pain of the mouth, the teeth, and the jaw, alongside guidance for the priest on how to interpret the symptoms, what omens to look for, and what rituals to perform in response. This was, in its own ancient way, an early form of clinical documentation, an attempt to systematize suffering, to create patterns and predictability out of the chaos of illness. When a patient arrived with a swollen jaw and unbearable pain, the priest would consult this accumulated wisdom, comparing the symptoms before him to those recorded by generations of healers who came before, searching for the correct diagnosis and the correct ritual response. One of the central rituals used to address persistent tooth pain involved what scholars call the Namburbi ritual, a category of ceremony designed specifically to counteract evil omens and undo the negative effects of a curse or divine displeasure. If the priest determined that the toothache was connected to some kind of omen, perhaps something unusual the sufferer had witnessed, an animal behaving strangely, an eclipse, a dream that seemed foreboding, the Namburbi ritual would be performed to release the person from the weight of that omen. This might involve washing the sufferer with specially prepared water, reciting incantations that invoked protective deities, and making small offerings, perhaps bread, dates, or beer, to appease whichever divine force had allowed the suffering to take hold. Imagine the atmosphere of such a ceremony, performed perhaps at dusk, in a small chamber lit by oil lamps, the priest's voice low and rhythmic as he recited ancient words in a ritual language, the sufferer sitting quietly, perhaps trembling slightly from pain and fever, family members standing nearby with heads bowed, all of them trusting that these ancient words carried a power beyond the physical world, a power capable of reaching into the invisible realm where the toothworm dwelled and driving it out. We should pause here and consider something important, something that speaks to the deep humanity woven into these ancient practices. It would be easy, from the comfort of our modern beds, surrounded by antibiotics and dental anesthesia, to look back at these rituals and see only superstition, only ignorance. But there is something profoundly compassionate happening in these ceremonies as well, something worth honoring rather than dismissing. A person in pain, confused and frightened by a suffering they could not explain, was not left alone. They were brought into the sacred center of their community. They were surrounded by ritual, by attention, by the collective belief of their entire society that their pain mattered enough to warrant the intervention of priests and gods. In many ways, this holistic, communal approach to suffering offered something that pure physical medicine alone cannot provide: a sense of meaning, a sense of being held within a larger, ordered universe even during moments of chaos and pain. The ritual itself, regardless of its actual effect on bacteria or nerve inflammation, likely provided genuine psychological comfort, the kind of comfort that can, in real and measurable ways, ease the perception of pain and promote healing through reduced stress and anxiety. Now, alongside these spiritual and religious interventions, the priests of Mesopotamian temples also served a more practical medical function, because many ashipu were also skilled in the preparation of physical remedies, blurring the line between priest and physician in ways that might seem unusual to modern eyes, but made perfect sense within their worldview. Temple complexes often maintained gardens specifically for medicinal plants, tended carefully by temple staff, providing a steady supply of the herbs and substances needed for both ritual and practical treatment. We know from surviving records that temples in cities like Isin, a city particularly associated with Gula, the goddess of healing, maintained substantial stores of medicinal ingredients, everything from dried herbs to minerals to animal products, all cataloged and available for use by the priests who served there. Gula herself deserves a moment of our attention here, because she represents something beautifully central to how Mesopotamians understood the healing of pain, including dental pain. Gula was often depicted alongside a dog, an animal associated in Mesopotamian belief with healing, perhaps because dogs were observed licking their own wounds, an act the ancient world interpreted as a form of natural medicine. Temples dedicated to Gula served almost like ancient hospitals, places where the sick and suffering could come to receive both spiritual comfort and practical care. If a person's toothache had progressed to the point of serious infection, perhaps what we would now recognize as a dental abscess, a pocket of infection at the root of the tooth, causing severe swelling, fever, and unbearable throbbing pain, they might make a specific pilgrimage to a temple of Gula, bringing offerings, seeking not just treatment but the direct intervention of the goddess herself, believed to work through the hands and knowledge of her priests. Let us imagine in vivid and gentle detail what such a pilgrimage might have looked like. A family in the countryside outside Isin, perhaps farmers who worked land along one of the many irrigation canals that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible, discovers that their eldest son has developed a severe, swollen jaw, the skin stretched tight and warm to the touch, his face flushed with fever, unable to eat or sleep for several days. The father, worried and increasingly desperate as home remedies fail to bring relief, decides the family must travel to the Temple of Gula. They gather what offerings they can afford, perhaps a jar of good beer, a basket of dates, perhaps a small woven cloth, and begin the journey along dusty roads lined with barley fields, swaying in the wind, passing other travelers, merchants leading donkeys loaded with goods, other families perhaps making similar pilgrimages of their own for different ailments. Upon arriving at the temple, they would be received by attendants, then eventually by a priest trained in both the spiritual rituals of Gula's worship and practical medical treatment. The priest examines the swollen jaw, perhaps pressing gently to gauge the severity of the swelling, checking for warmth and fever, listening carefully as the family describes how long the pain has persisted and what remedies have already been attempted at home. Based on this examination, informed by generations of accumulated medical knowledge preserved on temple tablets, the priest determines a course of treatment. This might include a poultice made from a combination of plants known to reduce swelling, perhaps something from the willow family. Since willow bark contains compounds related to salicylic acid, the same basic chemical family that gives us aspirin today, a connection that modern pharmacology has only recently come to fully appreciate, even as ancient healers stumbled toward it through centuries of careful observation and trial. The priest might also prepare a specific incantation to accompany the physical treatment, invoking Gula directly, asking her to lend her healing power to the herbs being applied, weaving together prayer and pharmacology into a single unified act of care. As the poultice is applied to the swollen jaw, the priest speaks the ancient words, his voice steady and practiced from years of performing similar rituals for countless other suffering patients who came before this family, and countless others who would come after. The family watches, hopeful, exhausted from worry and travel, finding comfort in the priest's calm confidence, in the ancient authority of his words, in the simple fact that something is finally being done for their son's suffering. It's worth noting here, as we continue to drift deeper into this ancient world together, that Mesopotamian medical practice included remarkably specific attention to different types of dental and oral ailments, suggesting a level of clinical observation that developed slowly over many centuries of careful documentation. Surviving texts distinguish between what appears to be simple tooth pain, likely corresponding to early-stage decay or sensitivity, and more severe conditions involving significant swelling and fever, likely corresponding to what we would today call dental abscesses, or more serious infections spreading into the surrounding tissue. This distinction mattered greatly for treatment, because the remedies prescribed for milder discomfort, simple herbal pastes, perhaps a rinse of beer mixed with certain plants, differed considerably from the more intensive rituals and stronger preparations used for severe, infected cases where the priest recognized that the sufferer's life itself might be at risk. This brings us to a crucial and sobering truth about ancient Mesopotamian dental suffering, one that we should sit with quietly for a moment before continuing further into our story. In a world without antibiotics, without surgical intervention beyond the most basic incisions, a severe dental infection, an abscess that spread into the bloodstream or into the deeper tissues of the face and neck, could indeed become fatal. Modern archaeological analysis of ancient Mesopotamian skeletal remains has revealed evidence of exactly this kind of severe dental disease, jawbones showing signs of significant infection, abscesses that clearly would have caused immense suffering, and in some cases, evidence suggesting that infection had spread beyond the tooth itself into the surrounding bone, a condition we now call osteomyelitis, something that even with the best efforts of priests and healers would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to survive using only the medical knowledge available at the time. And yet, even in the face of such serious danger, these ancient people continued their rituals, continued their careful preparation of herbal remedies, continued showing up for each other in temples and homes throughout the long river valleys of Mesopotamia, offering whatever comfort and treatment they possibly could, refusing to abandon the suffering to face their pain entirely alone. As we continue drifting through this ancient world together, let your body settle further into rest. Let your breathing continue to slow. Let the weight of your own day dissolve completely into the quiet rhythm of this history. We have walked together now through the temples of Sumer, through the rituals of priests and the healing power attributed to the goddess Gula, through the careful, compassionate attention given to suffering people thousands of years before our own time. There is still so much more of this story to uncover together. The legal responsibilities established under the great Babylonian King Hammurabi, the fascinating exchange of medical knowledge along ancient trade routes stretching toward Egypt, and the surprising sophistication of Assyrian medical practice preserved within one of history's greatest libraries. But for now, let this chapter settle over you like a warm blanket pulled up to your chin and allow yourself to rest here a while longer. In this ancient, distant past, safe and unhurried, as the priests of Gula continue their quiet work by lamplight, tending to the suffering of people who lived and breathed and hurt in exactly the same fundamental ways that we do today. We move now gently across the centuries, away from the ancient cities of Sumer and toward a new center of power rising along the banks of the Euphrates River, a city whose name would come to echo through history for thousands of years afterward, whispered in awe, in fear, and in wonder: Babylon. By the time we reach the reign of Hammurabi, sometime around 1792 to 1750 BCE, Babylon had grown from a modest city into the beating heart of an empire, a place of towering walls, bustling marketplaces, grand temples, and a legal and administrative sophistication that would shape civilization for millennia to come. And it is here in this remarkable city that we find some of the most fascinating evidence of how ancient Mesopotamian society thought not just about treating dental pain, but about the very responsibility and accountability surrounding medical practice itself. Let us begin by picturing Babylon at its height, a city protected by massive mud brick walls so thick that chariots could reportedly race along their tops, a city crossed by wide processional avenues, home to the magnificent temple of Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, and filled with merchants, scribes, farmers, artisans, and officials all moving through streets that buzzed with the energy of one of the ancient world's great metropolises. Within this bustling urban environment, medical practice had become increasingly regulated, increasingly professionalized, and increasingly documented, culminating in one of the most remarkable legal documents to survive from the ancient world, the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a towering stone stele nearly 7.5 feet tall, a monument that would eventually be discovered by archaeologists in 1901 at the site of Susa, where it had apparently been taken as war plunder centuries after its creation. The Code of Hammurabi contains 282 laws governing nearly every aspect of Babylonian life, from property disputes to marriage contracts to agricultural regulations to, remarkably, the practice of medicine itself. Several of these laws address the responsibilities and liabilities of physicians, providing us with an extraordinary window into how seriously Babylonian society took the practice of healing, including, we can reasonably infer, treatments related to the mouth and teeth. The laws specifically addressing medical practice reveal a system of accountability that might surprise those who assume ancient medicine existed entirely outside any formal structure or oversight. If a physician performed a successful operation, saving a patient's life or curing a serious ailment, the law specified generous payment, reflecting the genuine value placed on skilled medical practice. But the same code also specified severe consequences for medical failure, particularly when that failure resulted from apparent negligence or incompetence. This created, in essence, one of history's earliest formal systems of medical malpractice law, a system that, while harsh by modern standards, demonstrates just how seriously Babylonian society regarded the responsibility physicians held over their patients' bodies and well-being. It's worth pausing to consider what this meant practically for someone suffering from a severe toothache in ancient Babylon. Unlike in earlier Sumerian society, where the ashipu and assu operated with somewhat more informal community trust and religious authority, Babylonian physicians operated within a more codified professional structure, one where reputation, skill, and accountability carried real legal weight. A physician known throughout their neighborhood or city district for successfully treating dental abscesses, for skillfully land swollen gums to release infected fluid, for preparing effective herbal remedies that genuinely eased suffering, would have built a valuable reputation, one that brought both social standing and, quite literally under Babylonian law, protection from certain liabilities, since demonstrated competence and community trust factored into how disputes were judged and resolved. Let us imagine in careful and vivid detail a scene from daily life in Babylon during this period, perhaps in a modest merchant's home near the Ishtar Gate, That magnificent structure decorated with glazed brick images of dragons and bulls that would later become one of the most celebrated architectural achievements of the ancient world. A merchant named, let us say, Ibn Marduk, a name reflecting the common Babylonian practice of honoring the city's patron god with impersonal names, has been suffering for nearly a week with an increasingly painful lower molar, the pain radiating up into his ear and down into his jaw, making it nearly impossible to conduct his daily business at the marketplace, nearly impossible to eat solid food, nearly impossible to find rest at night, despite complete exhaustion. His wife, increasingly worried as his condition worsens and a low fever begins to develop, insists that he seek out Marduk Nasir, a physician known throughout their district for his skill in treating ailments of the mouth and teeth. Ibn Marduk, reluctant at first, as many suffering people throughout history have been reluctant to seek help, finally relents when the pain becomes truly unbearable, when sleep becomes impossible even from sheer exhaustion, when the swelling along his jaw becomes visible even to casual observers in the marketplace. He makes his way, slowly and carefully, favoring the uninjured side of his face, through the winding streets of Babylon toward the modest home and treatment space of Marduk Nasir, carrying with him payment in silver since, by this period in Mesopotamian history, silver had become an increasingly standardized medium of exchange, weighed carefully on small bronze scales to ensure fair payment for services rendered. Upon arrival, Marduk Nasir would have conducted what we might recognize as a surprisingly methodical examination, drawing on generations of accumulated Babylonian medical knowledge passed down through apprenticeship and the careful study of medical texts. He would examine the swollen area, perhaps pressing gently to assess the extent and severity of the swelling, checking Ibn Marduk's temperature by feeling his forehead and the skin along his neck, asking detailed questions about how long the pain had persisted, whether it had worsened progressively, whether certain foods or temperatures made the pain more intense, information that even modern dentists still consider crucial diagnostic clues today. This kind of careful, systematic questioning, remarkably similar in structure to modern medical history-taking, reveals just how sophisticated Babylonian medical practice had become by this period, built upon centuries of careful observation and refinement. Based on this examination, Marduk Nasir determines that Ibn Marduk is suffering from what modern dentistry would likely recognize as a periapical abscess, an infection that has spread from a decayed tooth down into the root and surrounding bone tissue, creating a painful pocket of infected fluid that desperately needs to be released to relieve pressure and allow healing to begin. This is where Babylonian medical practice enters genuinely fascinating territory, because surviving medical texts and archaeological evidence suggest that Mesopotamian healers, by this point in history, had developed actual surgical techniques for addressing exactly this kind of severe dental infection, using a small, carefully sharpened implement, likely made of bronze given the widespread availability and use of bronze tools throughout Babylonian society. Marduk Nasir would make a careful incision into the swollen gum tissue, allowing the built-up infected fluid to drain away, immediately relieving the tremendous pressure that had been causing Ibn Marduk such agonizing pain. We should acknowledge here, honestly and directly, that this procedure would have been performed without any form of anesthesia beyond perhaps a strong dose of beer or wine to dull the senses somewhat, and without any understanding of bacterial infection in the way we understand it today, meaning the risk of introducing further infection through the very instruments meant to provide relief remained a genuine and serious danger. And yet, despite these very real risks, the relief provided by releasing an abscess's built-up pressure would have been immediate and profound, likely the single most effective treatment available anywhere in the ancient world for this particular type of severe dental suffering. Following this procedure, Marduk Nasir would likely have applied a carefully prepared poultice to the affected area, drawing on the extensive Babylonian pharmacological tradition we discussed earlier, perhaps combining crushed herbs known for their soothing properties with a base of animal fat or plant oil, creating a paste that could be packed against the wound to promote healing and reduce further swelling. He might have prescribed a specific diet for the following days, likely recommending soft foods, warm broths, perhaps specifically avoiding foods that were too hot, too cold, or too hard. Guidance that remarkably aligns closely with modern post-dental procedure recovery recommendations, another quiet thread connecting ancient practical wisdom to our own contemporary understanding of healing and recovery. The financial and social dimensions of this medical encounter also deserve our attention because they reveal something important about how Babylonian society structured access to medical care, a structure that, honestly, contained significant inequality reflecting the broader social stratification present throughout Babylonian civilization. The Code of Hammurabi specifically outlines different fee structures based on the social status of the patient, with different rates specified for treating what the code refers to as a gentleman, someone of higher social standing, compared to treating a commoner or treating someone in a condition of slavery, which unfortunately existed as an accepted institution throughout Mesopotamian society during this period. This meant that access to skilled physicians like Marduk-Nasr and the more effective treatments they could provide was not equally available to all members of society, with wealthier individuals able to afford more experienced practitioners and more elaborate treatments, while poorer families often had to rely on more basic home remedies. Community knowledge passed between neighbors, or the charitable treatment sometimes provided through temple complexes we discussed in our previous chapter. This social reality adds a layer of poignant humanity to our understanding of ancient dental suffering because it means that the experience of a toothache in ancient Babylon was not a single, uniform experience but one deeply shaped by a person's social and economic circumstances, just as access to quality dental and medical care remains shaped by similar factors even in our own modern world today. A sobering continuity that connects us across nearly 4,000 years of human history. A poor farmer's wife suffering from a severe toothache, unable to afford the fees of a physician like Marduk-Nasr, might instead rely entirely on the remedies she could prepare herself from herbs grown in her own small garden, or seek the free but perhaps less specialized care available through temple charity, enduring her suffering with considerably fewer resources than a wealthy merchant's family might access. Beyond the specific medical and surgical treatments we've discussed, Babylonian society also continued and expanded upon the pharmacological traditions established in earlier Sumerian practice, developing an increasingly sophisticated understanding of which plants, minerals, and animal products provided genuine relief for dental pain and infection. Surviving Babylonian medical texts, often written in the form of detailed prescriptions almost resembling modern medical recipes, specify precise combinations of ingredients for treating various forms of tooth and mouth ailments. These texts frequently call for ingredients like myrrh, a resin harvested from certain trees native to regions south of Mesopotamia and obtained through extensive trade networks, valued for its genuine antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties that modern chemistry has since confirmed, alongside more locally available ingredients like date palm resin, various oils, and specific plants cultivated specifically for their medicinal properties within temple and private gardens. The preparation of these remedies followed careful, almost ceremonial procedures, reflecting the deep respect Babylonian society held for medical knowledge and practice. A physician preparing a remedy for dental pain might grind dried herbs using a small stone mortar and pestle, carefully measuring quantities based on prescriptions memorized through years of apprenticeship or recorded on personal collections of clay tablets passed down within families of hereditary physicians. Since medical knowledge in Babylonian society often passed through specific family lines, with sons apprenticing under fathers, gradually absorbing decades of accumulated practical wisdom before eventually practicing independently themselves. As we continue moving deeper into this long, unhurried journey through ancient history, let yourself sink further into rest. Let the details of Babylon's ancient streets and its careful, methodical physicians blur gently at the edges of your awareness, becoming less something to actively follow and more something to simply drift alongside. like a warm current carrying you slowly towards sleep. We have walked together now through the legal codes governing medical practice, through the social realities shaping who could access quality dental care, through the careful surgical techniques used to relieve the agony of dental abscesses nearly 4,000 years before modern dentistry would develop its own more refined versions of remarkably similar procedures. There remains still more of this ancient story to explore together. The fascinating exchange of medical knowledge that flowed along trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to distant Egypt, the surprising sophistication preserved within the great library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, and the quiet, universal humanity connecting all these ancient efforts to ease one of history's most persistent and relatable forms of suffering. But for now, let Babylon's ancient streets fade softly into the darkness behind your closing eyes. Let Marduk Nasir's careful hands and quiet expertise become simply another gentle thread in this long, soothing tapestry of history, and rest here a while longer, safe within this distant, ancient past. Let us now widen our view, drifting away from the walls of Babylon and following instead the long, dusty threads of trade that connected Mesopotamia to the wider ancient world. Because no civilization, however great, ever developed its knowledge in complete isolation. The people of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys existed within a vast web of exchange, one that stretched westward toward the Mediterranean coast, southward toward the Arabian Peninsula, and further still toward the great civilization flourishing along the banks of the Nile River, ancient Egypt. And within this enormous slow-moving current of merchants, caravans, and traveling scholars, ideas about medicine, about healing, and yes, about the treatment of aching teeth, flowed back and forth across centuries, blending and mingling in ways that quietly shaped the development of dental care throughout the entire ancient Near East. Picture, if you will, a merchant caravan departing from Babylon sometime during the height of its power, laden with goods destined for distant markets, woven textiles dyed in rich purples and blues, finely crafted pottery, tablets of accumulated knowledge copied by scribes for trade, and perhaps most relevant to our story tonight, bundles of dried medicinal herbs cultivated in the fertile soil between the two great rivers. These caravans moved slowly, following ancient routes worn smooth by centuries of previous travelers, crossing arid stretches of desert where water sources determined the very path of civilization's exchange, stopping at oasis towns and smaller settlements along the way, trading not just physical goods but stories, techniques, and accumulated wisdom with every stop. The connection between Mesopotamia and Egypt deserves particular attention in our story tonight, because these two ancient civilizations, despite their considerable geographic distance and distinct cultural identities, developed remarkably similar approaches to certain aspects of dental care, likely through a combination of independent discovery and genuine cultural exchange facilitated by trade, diplomacy, and the movement of skilled practitioners between courts and civilizations. Egyptian medical texts, some surviving in remarkable condition due to Egypt's dry climate, including the famous Ebers Papyrus dating to around 1550 BCE, reveal dental treatments and beliefs strikingly similar to those we've already explored in Mesopotamia, including, remarkably, their own version of the toothworm myth, suggesting either genuine independent development of similar folk explanations for dental pain, or perhaps evidence of much older, shared beliefs stretching back to common ancestral cultures that predated both civilizations as we know them. Let us imagine a specific historical moment that captures this fascinating cross-cultural exchange, drawing on what we know about diplomatic relations between Mesopotamian kingdoms and Egyptian pharaohs during certain periods of ancient history. Consider the elaborate diplomatic correspondence preserved in what modern scholars call the Amarna letters, a remarkable collection of clay tablets discovered in Egypt, written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East during this period, revealing detailed communication between Egyptian pharaohs and various Mesopotamian and Levantine rulers during the 14th century BCE. Within these letters, alongside discussions of marriage alliances, military support, and valuable gifts exchanged between royal courts, We find occasional references to physicians being requested and sent between kingdoms, skilled healers whose reputation had spread far beyond their home cities, valued highly enough that foreign rulers specifically requested their services. Imagine, then, a skilled Babylonian physician, renowned throughout Mesopotamia for treating even the most severe cases of dental abscess and infection, receiving word that an Egyptian pharaoh, suffering from persistent and severe tooth pain that his own Egyptian physicians had been unable to fully resolve, has specifically requested his presence at the Egyptian royal court. This physician would embark on a long journey, traveling first by river barge along the Euphrates, then joining a merchant caravan for the overland journey across the Levant, eventually reaching the Nile Delta and continuing upriver toward wherever the pharaoh's court currently resided, carrying with him not just his physical instruments and prepared remedies, but decades of accumulated Mesopotamian medical knowledge, techniques for lancing abscesses, specific herbal combinations proven effective through generations of careful use, incantations and rituals believed to strengthen the physical treatment through spiritual reinforcement. Upon arrival, this physician would encounter Egyptian medical practitioners with their own sophisticated traditions, their own accumulated wisdom preserved in papyrus scrolls rather than clay tablets, their own understanding of dental anatomy that remarkably included some genuinely advanced concepts, evidenced by archaeological discoveries of ancient Egyptian mummies showing signs of dental bridgework, teeth bound together with gold wire, suggesting attempts at what we might recognize as early prosthodontic intervention, technology that in some respects appears to have exceeded what we know of contemporary Mesopotamian dental practice. In this meeting of medical traditions, we can imagine genuine professional exchange occurring. Egyptian physicians sharing their techniques for stabilizing loose teeth using precious metal wire, Mesopotamian physicians sharing their particularly effective herbal preparations and their methods for safely lancing severe abscesses, each tradition enriching the other through this quiet, cross-cultural collaboration happening in the treatment rooms of ancient royal courts. This exchange of knowledge did not flow in only one direction, and it did not happen only at the elevated level of royal courts and famous physicians. Throughout the long centuries of contact between these civilizations, facilitated by countless ordinary merchants, travelers, and settlers moving between regions, dental remedies and beliefs mixed and blended at every level of society. Consider, for instance, the spread of specific medicinal plants between these regions, plants that grew natively in one area but were deliberately transported and cultivated in another once their medicinal properties became known through trade contact. Myrrh, which we mentioned earlier as a key ingredient in Babylonian dental remedies, actually originated primarily from regions in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, reaching Mesopotamia through extensive trade networks that also connected to Egypt, meaning both civilizations likely gained access to this valuable resin through overlapping trade relationships, each developing their own specific applications and preparation methods even while drawing from the very same source material. Let us slow down here and imagine in gentle and specific detail the actual physical journey of myrrh resin from its origin to its eventual use easing a Mesopotamian farmer's toothache, because tracing this journey helps us truly appreciate the remarkable interconnectedness of the ancient world, a world we sometimes mistakenly imagine as isolated and disconnected compared to our own modern globalized existence. Harvesters in southern Arabia would carefully cut into the bark of specific desert trees, collecting the resin that seeped out and hardened into small, fragrant droplets over subsequent days. This resin would be gathered, sorted by quality, and sold to merchants who transported it by camel caravan northward, crossing significant stretches of harsh desert terrain, trading through various intermediary markets along the way, each transaction adding value and cost, until eventually reaching major trading hubs where Mesopotamian merchants could purchase quantities destined for cities like Babylon, Ur, or Nineveh. Once arrived in Mesopotamia, this myrrh might pass through several more hands, perhaps sold initially to a wealthy merchant who deals specifically in imported luxury goods, then resold in smaller quantities to physicians and temple kupses who required it for medicinal preparations, finally arriving in the hands of someone like Marduk Nasir, the physician we imagined earlier treating Ibn Marduk's dental abscess, who would carefully measure out a small quantity for his prepared remedies. This resin, having traveled thousands of miles across deserts and through countless market transactions, would finally be ground carefully, mixed with other ingredients, and applied directly to ease the suffering of an ordinary person experiencing the same universal pain that connects human beings across every culture and every era of history. This vast network of trade and exchange also brought other significant influences into Mesopotamian dental practice, particularly from regions to the north and east, areas we now associate with ancient Persia and the broader Iranian plateau, as well as connections extending toward the Indus Valley civilization flourishing in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India during roughly the same historical period. Archaeological evidence suggests remarkably early dental intervention occurring within Indus Valley sites, including discoveries of drilled teeth dating back several thousand years, evidence of what researchers believe represents deliberate attempts to remove decayed material from within a tooth, essentially an extremely early precursor to modern dental drilling and filling techniques. While direct evidence of specific technological exchange between Indus Valley and Mesopotamian dental practices remains limited, we do know these civilizations maintained trade contact, particularly through maritime routes, connecting the Persian Gulf to ports along the western coast of the Indian subcontinent, suggesting at least the possibility that awareness of such advanced techniques may have traveled, even if the specific technology itself did not fully transfer between these distinct medical traditions. Let us return now to Mesopotamia itself and consider how this constant influx of foreign goods, ideas, and occasionally foreign physicians gradually enriched and expanded the existing framework of dental treatment we discussed in our previous chapters. By the later periods of Mesopotamian history, particularly during the height of Assyrian power, which we will explore in much greater depth in our next chapter, we see evidence of an increasingly sophisticated pharmacological tradition incorporating ingredients and techniques drawn from across this vast trading network. Medical texts from this period reference substances originating from regions as far away as the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Iranian plateau, and the Arabian Peninsula, suggesting that Mesopotamian physicians had access to an increasingly diverse toolkit of remedies, allowing them to experiment with different combinations and approaches when treating particularly stubborn or severe cases of dental pain and infection. It's worth pausing here, as we drift further into this long night's journey through ancient history, to reflect on something quietly beautiful about this pattern of exchange, this slow, patient sharing of knowledge across vast distances and between different peoples who might otherwise have had little direct contact with one another. In a world without instant communication, without the ability to simply search for information, consult international medical literature the way we so casually do today, the spread of effective dental remedies depended entirely on human networks, on merchants willing to carry not just goods but knowledge across dangerous desert crossings, on physicians willing to travel far from home to share their expertise with foreign courts, on countless anonymous individuals who noticed that a particular imported herb seemed to ease their neighbor's toothache and shared that observation with others in their community. This slow, human-powered spread of medical knowledge, built entirely on patience, observation, and genuine care for easing suffering, represents its own quiet testament to human ingenuity and compassion, one that connects the ancient farmers of Mesopotamia to the ancient craftsmen of the Indus Valley, to the physicians of pharaonic Egypt, all working, independently yet somehow collectively, toward the same fundamental goal of easing the universal agony of an aching tooth. As we continue drifting deeper into rest together, let these images of ancient caravans and traded remedies blur softly at the edges of your mind, becoming less something to actively track and more simply a gentle, flowing current carrying you toward sleep. We have traveled together now along the ancient trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt and beyond, discovered the remarkable parallel developments occurring across different ancient civilizations, and traced the long, patient journey of remedies like myrrh from distant desert trees to the hands of suffering patients throughout the ancient Near East. There remains still more of our journey to complete together. The sophisticated medical library assembled by the Assyrian King Ashurbanipal, the daily realities of diet and dental health, revealed through archaeological analysis of ancient remains, and the long, lasting legacy these ancient beliefs and practices would leave upon the centuries of human history that followed. But for now, let yourself rest here a while longer, in this vast and interconnected ancient world, safe within the knowledge that even 4,000 years ago, human beings were reaching across enormous distances to help ease each other's suffering, one small remedy, one careful exchange, one patient act of compassion at a time. We travel now northward, following the course of the Tigris River as it winds through increasingly hilly terrain, away from the flat alluvial plains of Sumer and Babylon, toward a civilization that would eventually build one of the ancient world's most formidable empires, stretching its influence from the mountains of Persia to the borders of Egypt itself. This is Assyria, a civilization whose name still carries, even thousands of years later, connotations of military might, of conquest, of iron-fisted imperial control. But Assyria was also, perhaps surprisingly to those who know it only through its reputation for warfare, a civilization of remarkable scholarly achievement, a civilization that would ultimately preserve for us, through one extraordinary act of royal ambition, an unprecedented window into the medical knowledge of the ancient Near East, including invaluable details about how these ancient people continued their long struggle against the persistent universal suffering of dental pain. At the center of this story stands a king whose name has become almost synonymous with ancient learning and scholarly preservation, Ashurbanipal, who ruled the Assyrian Empire from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, presiding over the empire during what many historians consider its final period of great strength before its eventual and rather sudden collapse. Ashurbanipal was, by the standards of ancient rulers, a genuinely unusual figure, someone who took immense personal pride not just in military conquest and administrative control, but in scholarship itself, in the accumulation and preservation of knowledge, commissioning scribes throughout his vast empire to collect, copy, and preserve texts covering nearly every aspect of ancient Mesopotamian intellectual achievement, assembling what would become known to modern archaeologists and historians as the Library of Ashurbanipal, housed within his magnificent palace complex in the city of Nineveh. Let us imagine, in careful and vivid detail, the process by which this remarkable library came into being, because understanding this process helps us appreciate just how deliberately and thoroughly Ashurbanipal worked to preserve medical knowledge, including everything his scribes could gather regarding the treatment of dental ailments. The king dispatched scribes throughout his empire to ancient cities like Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, and cities whose scholarly tradition stretched back well over 1,000 years before Ashurbanipal's own reign, with explicit instructions to locate, copy, and bring back to Nineveh any and all texts of value, medical treatises, religious incantations, astronomical observations, literary works, administrative records, essentially attempting to create a comprehensive repository of all accumulated human knowledge available within his vast realm. Picture one of these scribes, sent perhaps to the ancient and revered city of Nippur, long considered one of the most important centers of scholarly and religious tradition throughout Mesopotamian history, home to temples and scribal schools that had operated continuously for well over a millennium by this point. This scribe would work carefully through the temple archives and private collections of local scholarly families, identifying tablets containing valuable medical knowledge, including, we can reasonably assume, some of the very same texts and traditions we discussed earlier regarding the treatment of dental pain, the ancient toothworm incantations, the detailed diagnostic guidance developed by scholars like Isigil Kinapli, The accumulated pharmacological knowledge regarding which herbs and preparations proved most effective for easing different types of oral suffering. Once identified, these texts would need to be carefully copied, a laborious process requiring significant skill and patience, since Mesopotamian cuneiform writing involved pressing a reed stylus into wet clay to create the distinctive wedge-shaped marks that gave this writing system its modern name, derived from the Latin word for wedge. A skilled scribe, trained for years within the scribal schools that operated throughout Mesopotamian cities, would sit with the original ancient tablet before him, carefully reading each line, then reproducing it precisely onto a fresh tablet of prepared clay, working meticulously to ensure accuracy, since any errors introduced during this copying process would then be preserved and potentially propagated through any future copies made from this new version. This process could take considerable time depending on the length and complexity of the text being copied, with particularly important or lengthy medical treatises potentially requiring days of careful, concentrated work to fully transcribe. Once completed, these copied tablets would be carefully packed and transported back to Nineveh, likely traveling by river barge along the Tigris and its tributaries where possible, since water transport remained far more efficient than overland travel for moving heavy cargo like clay tablets across significant distances. Upon arrival at Nineveh, these tablets would be cataloged and organized within Ashurbanipal's palace library, a physical space that archaeological excavations have revealed to have contained thousands upon thousands of individual clay tablets, organized by subject matter, with medical texts forming a substantial and significant portion of this vast collection. It is specifically through this remarkable library, discovered by archaeologists during excavations of Nineveh beginning in the mid-19th century, that many of the medical texts we've discussed throughout our journey tonight have actually survived into the modern era, preserved not through mere accident, but through Ashurbanipal's deliberate, systematic effort to gather and protect the accumulated medical wisdom of his civilization. Without this remarkable act of ancient scholarly preservation, much of what we now know about Mesopotamian dental treatment, the toothworm incantations, the detailed diagnostic guidance, the careful pharmacological preparations might well have been lost entirely to history, the clay tablets containing this knowledge crumbling to dust in provincial temples and private homes long before modern archaeology could ever discover and translate them. Within this vast library, medical texts specifically addressing dental and oral ailments reveal a level of sophistication and systematic organization that continued to develop and refine the traditions we've explored. Throughout our journey tonight, Assyrian physicians, building upon centuries of accumulated Sumerian and Babylonian medical knowledge, had developed increasingly detailed and specific treatment protocols for various forms of dental suffering, moving beyond general remedies toward more nuanced, differentiated approaches based on careful clinical observation. Let us imagine once more a specific scene from daily Assyrian life, perhaps set with Nineveh itself during the height of Ashurbanipal's reign. This magnificent city with its towering walls, its elaborate palace reliefs depicting royal hunts and military triumphs, its bustling markets drawing merchants and goods from across the vast Assyrian Empire. Consider a scribe working within the palace complex itself, someone whose daily work involves the careful copying and organization of texts for the royal library, who begins experiencing the familiar, dreaded symptoms of dental pain, perhaps starting as mild sensitivity while eating and gradually progressing over several days into more persistent, throbbing discomfort that begins to interfere with his concentration and his delicate work. This scribe, given his position within the palace and his access to the very medical texts he helps organize and preserve, might actually consult these written sources directly, searching through the categorized medical tablets for guidance on treating his specific symptoms, essentially conducting his own informed self-diagnosis using the accumulated written wisdom of centuries of Mesopotamian medical tradition. He might locate a specific tablet detailing treatment for what the text describes as pain localized to a specific tooth, accompanied by sensitivity to both very cold water and very hot liquids, symptoms that modern dentistry would immediately recognize as indicating dental decay approaching or reaching the tooth's inner pulp tissue, where the nerve and blood supply reside, creating exactly this pattern of heightened sensitivity to temperature extremes. Following the guidance found within this ancient text, our scribe might prepare a specific remedy himself, drawing on ingredients readily available within the palace complex or the broader city market, perhaps combining crushed juniper berries, valued for their genuine antimicrobial properties that modern research has since confirmed, with a small amount of animal fat to create a paste that could be packed directly against the affected tooth, providing both a physical barrier against further temperature sensitivity and whatever antimicrobial benefit the juniper might genuinely provide against the underlying bacterial infection driving the decay process, even though the scribe himself would have understood this treatment entirely through the framework of ancient Mesopotamian medical theory, rather than our modern understanding of bacteria and infection. If this initial self-treatment proved insufficient and the pain continued progressing despite his best efforts, our scribe would then seek out one of the professional physicians maintained within the royal palace itself, since a ruler as wealthy and powerful as Ashurbanipal would certainly have retained skilled medical practitioners specifically for treating the royal family, court officials, and valued palace staff like scribes whose specialized skills made them valuable enough to warrant quality medical attention. This palace physician, likely trained through years of apprenticeship and study of exactly the kind of medical text being preserved within Ashurbanipal's library, would conduct a more thorough examination, potentially identifying signs of a developing abscess, requiring the kind of surgical intervention we discussed in our previous chapter regarding Babylonian medical practice, since these techniques had continued developing and refining themselves across the centuries, separating Hammurabi's Babylon from Ashurbanipal's Assyria. The Assyrian medical tradition, as preserved within this remarkable library, also reveals fascinating evidence of increasingly sophisticated understanding regarding the relationship between overall bodily health and specific dental ailments, suggesting that ancient physicians had begun observing patterns we would recognize today as connections between systemic illness and oral health, even though they interpreted these patterns through their own theoretical framework of bodily humors, divine influence, and demonic affliction, rather than our modern understanding of interconnected biological systems. Certain texts specifically address situations where dental pain appears connected to broader illness affecting the entire body, suggesting physicians had observed, through simple accumulated clinical experience across countless treated patients, that severe dental infections sometimes coincided with or perhaps even contributed to more widespread physical distress, fever, weakness, and general malaise extending well beyond the immediate area of the affected tooth itself. This observation, remarkably prescient even if explained through an entirely different theoretical framework than modern medicine would employ, actually anticipates something we now understand quite clearly through contemporary dental and medical research: the genuine connection between oral health and overall systemic health. The way severe untreated dental infections can indeed contribute to broader bodily illnesses as bacteria and inflammatory responses spread beyond the immediate site of infection. That ancient Assyrian physicians, working without any understanding of bacteria, without microscopes, without any of our modern diagnostic tools, nonetheless observed and documented patterns suggesting this same fundamental connection between oral and systemic health, speaks to the genuine power of careful, patient, accumulated clinical observation, even when operating within an entirely different explanatory framework than our own modern scientific understanding. As Ashurbanipal's library continued growing throughout his reign, eventually housing not just medical texts but the accumulated literary, religious, historical, and scientific knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization stretching back well over 1,000 years, it created something genuinely unprecedented in the ancient world: a centralized, systematic repository of knowledge that scholars and physicians throughout the empire could potentially access and consult, creating opportunities for medical knowledge to be shared, compared, and refined in ways that would have been considerably more difficult when such knowledge remained scattered across countless individual temple archives and private family collections throughout Mesopotamia's various cities. Tragically, and perhaps fittingly given the turbulent nature of Assyrian imperial power built so heavily on military conquest, this magnificent library would eventually meet a violent end, destroyed during the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE. When a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces finally overthrew Assyrian imperial power after decades of resentment against Assyrian military domination throughout the region. The very fires that consumed Ashurbanipal's palace during this final, catastrophic siege, ironically, helped preserve for modern archaeology the very clay tablets housed within his library, since the intense heat of the fire effectively baked and hardened the clay tablets, transforming what might otherwise have remained more fragile, unfired clay into durable, fired ceramic capable of surviving over 2,500 years buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh, waiting patiently for archaeologists to eventually rediscover and translate this remarkable window into ancient medical knowledge, including the detailed record of how these people fought against the same persistent dental suffering that continues afflicting human beings, even in our own modern era. As we continue our long, unhurried journey through this ancient history together, let yourself sink even further into rest. Let the image of Nineveh's burning palace and its miraculously preserved clay tablets blur softly into the edges of your consciousness, becoming simply another gentle thread in this vast tapestry of human history and human suffering, human ingenuity and human compassion. We have traveled together now through the remarkable scholarly ambition of Ashurbanipal, through the daily life of a palace scribe, seeking relief from his own dental pain using centuries of accumulated written wisdom, through the tragic yet strangely fortunate circumstances that preserve this ancient medical knowledge for our own modern discovery. There remains still more of our journey to complete together, the daily realities of diet, aging, and dental health, revealed through careful archaeological analysis of ancient skeletal remains, and the long, quiet legacy these ancient beliefs and practices would leave echoing forward through the centuries of human history that followed. But for now, let yourself rest here a while longer, safe within the glow of this ancient library's lamplight, safe within the knowledge that even as empires rose and fell, as cities burned and were rebuilt, human beings continued their patient, careful work of gathering knowledge, of easing suffering, of caring for each other through pain that connects us across every possible boundary of time and culture. Let us step back now from the palaces and temples, from the kings and scribes and physicians whose stories tend to survive most clearly in the historical record, and turn our attention instead towards something quieter, something closer to the ordinary texture of daily Mesopotamian life, because it is in the details of everyday existence, the food people ate, the work they performed, the slow accumulation of years upon their bodies, that we find perhaps the most intimate and revealing evidence of how dental pain actually shaped the lived experience of ancient people across every level of society. And remarkably, much of what we know about this daily reality comes not from clay tablets or written records at all, but from something far more direct and personal, the physical remains of the ancient people themselves, their bones, and most relevant to our story tonight, their teeth, patiently waiting within the earth for thousands of years until modern archaeology could finally examine them and read the story they silently preserved. Let's begin by considering the fundamental nature of the ancient Mesopotamian diet, because understanding what these people actually ate, day after day, year after year, across entire lifetimes, helps us understand why dental problems were likely such a persistent and widespread feature of ancient life, affecting people across every social class, from the humblest farmer to the wealthiest merchant, though certainly in different ways and to different degrees, depending on their specific circumstances. The foundation of Mesopotamian agriculture, and therefore the foundation of the Mesopotamian diet, rested heavily on barley, cultivated extensively, throughout the fertile floodplains created by the careful irrigation systems these people developed to manage the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This barley was ground into flour and used to create the bread that formed the absolute staple of daily nutrition for virtually everyone throughout Mesopotamian society, alongside barley's other crucial use in brewing the beer that, as we've discussed throughout our journey tonight, played such a central role not just in daily nutrition and hydration but in medical treatment as well. Now, here is something worth considering carefully, something that connects directly to the prevalence of dental problems throughout ancient Mesopotamian society. The process of grinding barley into flour during this period relied entirely on stone grinding implements, typically consisting of a lower stationary stone called a saddle quern, and an upper handheld stone used to crush and grind the barley grains through repeated, laborious motion, work that fell predominantly to women throughout Mesopotamian households, representing hours of daily physical labor required simply to produce the flour needed for a single family's bread supply. This grinding process, however necessary and however skillfully performed, inevitably introduced small particles of stone grit into the resulting flour, tiny fragments worn away from the grinding stones themselves through the friction of daily use. When this flour was then baked into bread and consumed daily, meal after meal, year after year, decade after decade, these tiny stone particles created a slow, relentless abrasive effect on human teeth, gradually wearing down the enamel and dentin through countless thousands of chewing motions across an entire lifetime. Modern archaeological analysis of ancient Mesopotamian teeth has revealed exactly this pattern, remarkably severe tooth wear, far exceeding what we typically see in modern populations, with many individuals showing significant flattening and wearing of their molars and other teeth by middle age, wear patterns that would have exposed increasingly sensitive dentin and, in more severe cases, potentially expose the tooth's inner pulp tissue entirely, creating exactly the kind of severe, chronic dental pain we've discussed throughout our journey tonight. Let us imagine, in careful and specific detail, what this gradual process might have actually felt like for an ordinary Mesopotamian person living out an entire lifetime within this dietary reality. Picture a woman born in a small agricultural village near the Euphrates River, perhaps during the height of Babylonian power under Hammurabi's rule, someone whose entire life would be shaped by the rhythms of agricultural labor, of grinding grain, of preparing bread and beer for her family, of raising children within the same patterns of daily life that her own mother and grandmother had followed before her. As a young child, her teeth would likely have been relatively healthy, showing minimal wear, capable of comfortably processing whatever foods her family provided. But as the years passed, as she grew into adulthood and took on the full daily labor expected of Mesopotamian women, the accumulated effect of consuming stone-flecked bread meal after meal would begin gradually wearing down her teeth. Slowly at first, barely noticeable across any single year, but accumulating steadily across decades of consistent daily consumption. By the time she reached her 30s or 40s, an age that, given the generally shorter average lifespans throughout ancient Mesopotamian society, would already represent a substantial portion of her expected lifetime, her molars would likely show significant flattening and wear, the protective enamel layer worn away in places, exposing the more sensitive dentin layer beneath, creating exactly the kind of persistent sensitivity to hot and cold foods that we discussed in our previous chapter regarding the palace scribe's dental troubles in Nineveh. This gradual cumulative dental wear, combined with the more familiar forms of tooth decay caused by sugars and starches feeding bacteria within the mouth, meant that dental pain and dental problems were likely an almost universal feature of adult life throughout ancient Mesopotamian society, affecting virtually everyone to some degree by middle age, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances, though certainly wealthier individuals with access to more varied diets, less reliant on the specific stone-ground barley bread forming the foundation of poorer households' nutrition, may have experienced somewhat less severe wear patterns, while still likely experiencing their own forms of dental decay related to the sugars present in dates, honey, and other foods more readily available to wealthier households. Archaeological analysis has revealed fascinating details about exactly how these dental problems manifested across different Mesopotamian populations and time periods, providing us with genuinely intimate glimpses into the physical suffering experienced by ordinary ancient people whose individual names and personal stories have otherwise been entirely lost to history, preserved only through the silent testimony of their own skeletal remains. Studies examining ancient Mesopotamian burial sites have documented extensive evidence of dental abscesses, visible as small holes or channels formed within the jawbone itself, created as infected material drained from an abscessed tooth root through the surrounding bone tissue. Physical evidence of exactly the kind of severe, dangerous dental infection we discussed earlier as being potentially life-threatening in an era before antibiotics or modern surgical intervention. Consider for a moment the profound weight of what these physical remains actually represent, not merely abstract archaeological data points, but genuine evidence of real human suffering experienced by real individuals who lived and breathed and hurt in exactly the same fundamental ways we do today. Each abscess visible within an ancient jawbone represents weeks, perhaps months, of accumulated pain before the infection finally progressed to that point, represents sleepless nights, difficulty eating, the constant background presence of throbbing discomfort that likely affected every aspect of that person's daily life and emotional well-being. Exactly the kind of suffering we've explored throughout our journey tonight, through the various rituals, remedies, and medical interventions ancient Mesopotamian society developed in response. Beyond abscesses, archaeological analysis has also revealed extensive evidence of tooth loss throughout ancient Mesopotamian populations, with many skeletal remains showing multiple missing teeth, particularly among older individuals. Evidence of the cumulative effect of decades of dental wear, decay, and infection eventually resulting in teeth becoming so damaged or loose that they were lost entirely, whether through the natural progression of disease or, in some cases, potentially through deliberate extraction performed by physicians attempting to relieve severe, unmanageable pain when other treatments had proven insufficient. This brings us to consider something we haven't yet explored in detail throughout our journey tonight: the question of tooth extraction itself, because while much of our story has focused on remedies aimed at preserving and treating troubled teeth, there would inevitably have been cases where a tooth became so severely damaged, so completely beyond any hope of relief through poultices, rituals, or even surgical drainage of abscesses, that removal became the only remaining option for ending a patient's suffering. Evidence for deliberate ancient Mesopotamian tooth extraction remains somewhat more limited and debated among archaeologists and historians compared to the extensive evidence we have for other treatments we've discussed, partly because distinguishing between deliberate extraction and simple tooth loss through decay or trauma can be genuinely difficult when examining ancient skeletal remains, but various textual references suggest that physicians did, when necessary, resort to physically removing teeth that had become hopelessly damaged. Let us imagine, with appropriate gravity and respect for the genuine difficulty of such a procedure, what a tooth extraction might have actually involved within ancient Mesopotamian medical practice. Without any of the specialized dental instruments developed by later civilizations, without any effective anesthesia, beyond perhaps a strong dose of alcohol, or the sedating properties of plants like henbane we discussed earlier, a physician faced with a patient suffering from a hopelessly damaged, severely infected tooth would need to work with basic tools, likely small bronze implements adapted from other medical or even craft purposes, attempting to loosen and eventually remove the offending tooth, while the patient endured what must have been a genuinely excruciating experience, held steady perhaps by family members or assistants, while the physician worked as quickly and carefully as possible to complete the procedure. We should sit with this reality for a moment, honestly and without flinching away from its difficulty. because doing so helps us genuinely appreciate both the desperate severity of untreated dental suffering that would drive someone to endure such a procedure, and the remarkable resilience and courage of ordinary ancient people who faced this kind of physical ordeal without any of the anesthetic options we now take entirely for granted in modern dentistry. A person choosing to undergo tooth extraction in ancient Mesopotamia was making a calculated decision that the temporary, intense agony of the procedure itself was preferable to the chronic, unrelenting suffering of a severely infected tooth left untreated. A decision that speaks volumes about just how severe and unbearable untreated dental infection could become within this ancient world. Following such a procedure, the physician would likely apply immediate treatment to the resulting wound, perhaps packing the empty socket with a specially prepared substance intended to control bleeding and prevent further infection, possibly incorporating some of the same herbal preparations we've discussed throughout our journey tonight, myrrh for its antiseptic properties, perhaps certain astringent plants, known to help constrict blood vessels and control bleeding, all applied with whatever combination of practical medical knowledge and accompanying protective incantation the physician deemed appropriate for this particularly serious intervention. Beyond these more severe interventions, archaeological and textual evidence also reveals fascinating details about broader oral hygiene practices throughout ancient Mesopotamian daily life, practices that, while considerably less sophisticated than modern dental care, nonetheless suggest genuine awareness of the importance of maintaining oral cleanliness as a preventive measure against exactly the kind of severe dental problems we've discussed throughout our journey tonight. Various texts and archaeological finds suggest the use of simple chew sticks, twigs from specific trees frayed at one end to create a crude brush-like texture used to physically scrub food particles from between teeth and along the gum line, representing an early precursor to the toothbrushes we use so casually in our own modern daily routines. Consider for a moment an ordinary Mesopotamian household at the end of a long day, perhaps in a modest home somewhere along the outskirts of Ur or Uruk, where a father might sit with his children after their evening meal, demonstrating how to properly use a frayed chew stick to clean away the remnants of barley bread and other foods trapped between their teeth, passing along this simple but genuinely valuable practice of preventive oral hygiene, knowledge accumulated across countless previous generations who had learned, through simple observation and experience, that keeping the mouth clean seemed to genuinely reduce the frequency and severity of dental problems, even without any understanding of the bacterial processes we now know actually drive tooth decay and gum disease. This same household might also incorporate specific dietary choices believed to support healthy teeth and gums, perhaps consume certain foods known through accumulated folk wisdom to be gentler on dental health, or avoiding particularly hard or gritty foods when someone in the family was already experiencing early signs of dental sensitivity or discomfort, representing a genuinely thoughtful, adaptive approach to managing dental health within the practical constraints and limited understanding available throughout ancient Mesopotamian society. As we continue drifting deeper into rest together throughout this long, unhurried night, let these images of ancient daily life, the rhythmic grinding of barley, the careful use of chew sticks, the quiet resilience of ordinary people enduring and adapting to the persistent reality of dental wear and decay saw softly into the edges of your consciousness, becoming simply another gentle current carrying you toward deeper and deeper rest. We have explored together now the intimate physical reality of ancient dental suffering as revealed through careful archaeological analysis, the daily practices of oral hygiene and dietary adaptation that ordinary Mesopotamian families developed across countless generations, and the genuine courage required to endure even the most difficult interventions when suffering became truly unbearable. There remains still one final chapter of our journey to complete together, considering the long, lasting legacy these ancient beliefs and practices would leave echoing forward through the centuries of human history that followed. Connecting the ancient world we've explored so thoroughly tonight to the modern understanding of dental care we now so easily take for granted. But for now, let yourself rest here a while longer, safe within this quiet, intimate portrait of ancient daily life, safe within the knowledge that ordinary human beings across every era of history have always found ways to adapt, to endure, and to care for each other through even the most persistent and universal forms of physical suffering. We arrive now, gently and slowly, at the final chapter of our long journey together tonight, a chapter that asks us to lift our gaze beyond Mesopotamia itself, beyond the specific centuries we've spent wandering through Sumerian temples and Babylonian courtrooms and Assyrian libraries, and instead trace the long, quiet echo these ancient beliefs and practices would leave rippling forward through the centuries and millennia that followed, connecting the ancient world we've explored so thoroughly tonight to the modern understanding of dental care that most of us now carry so casually, so unconsciously, within our own daily lives. Let us begin with that haunting image we encountered at the very beginning of our journey. Tonight, the toothworm, that small imagined creature believed to burrow into aching teeth, gnawing away at roots and feeding on blood, born from the marsh according to that ancient Mesopotamian myth, recorded so carefully on clay tablets and eventually preserved within Ashurbanipal's great library. This belief, remarkably, did not simply fade away and disappear alongside the eventual decline of Mesopotamian civilization itself. Instead, it traveled forward through time with a persistence that speaks to something deeply compelling and psychologically satisfying about this particular explanation for dental suffering, something that allowed it to survive and spread across cultures and centuries in ways that few other specific ancient medical beliefs managed to achieve. We find echoes of this same toothworm belief appearing throughout ancient Egyptian medical texts, as we discussed earlier in our journey tonight, and remarkably, this same fundamental belief continued appearing throughout medical traditions across the ancient and medieval world, from ancient Greek and Roman medical writers who inherited and adapted various aspects of earlier Mesopotamian and Egyptian medical knowledge, through medieval European medical traditions, through traditional Chinese medicine, and even persisting in various forms of folk medicine, well into relatively recent centuries, with some rural communities in parts of Europe and America maintaining some version of toothworm belief as recently as the 18th and even 19th centuries, an almost unbroken chain of belief stretching across more than 3,000 years of human history, all tracing back to that same ancient Mesopotamian myth first recorded on clay tablets in the reed-lined cities along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. There is something genuinely remarkable to consider here, something worth sitting with quietly as we begin easing toward the conclusion of our long journey together tonight. A story first told by Sumerian priests performed as ritual incantation beside the beds of suffering patients nearly 4,000 years ago, managed to survive in recognizable form across the rise and fall of countless subsequent civilizations, surviving the collapse of Mesopotamian power itself, surviving the rise and fall of ancient Egypt, surviving the classical world of Greece and Rome, surviving the tumultuous transitions of the medieval period, eventually only beginning to fade away as genuine scientific understanding of tooth decay developed through careful microscopic observation and chemical analysis beginning in the 17th and 18th centuries, finally provided a more accurate explanation for the mysterious gnawing pain of an aching tooth. This persistence speaks to something profound about human psychology and the nature of belief itself, something we touched upon earlier in our journey tonight when we first encountered the toothworm myth. Human beings, faced with pain and suffering they cannot directly see, cannot directly explain through immediate sensory observation, have always sought explanatory frameworks that provide some sense of understanding, some sense of narrative coherence, even when those explanations prove, by later scientific standards, to be factually incorrect. The toothworm provided exactly this kind of psychologically satisfying explanation, a small, comprehensible creature responsible for an otherwise confusing and frightening pain, an explanation concrete enough to visualize, specific enough to feel like genuine understanding rather than helpless confusion, even though it bore no resemblance to the actual bacterial processes we now understand to be responsible for dental decay. Beyond the persistence of this specific mythological belief, we can also trace more direct, practical connections between ancient Mesopotamian dental treatments and practices that continue, in recognizable form, within our own modern approach to dental care, connections that reveal a genuine thread of accumulated practical wisdom passed down across thousands of years of human experience, even as the theoretical understanding underlying these practices evolved dramatically over time. Consider, once more, that simple remedy of salt dissolved in water, used throughout ancient Mesopotamian society to soothe swollen, inflamed gums and provide some measure of relief from dental pain. This same basic remedy, salt water rinses for oral discomfort, remains genuinely recommended by modern dental professionals today, its effectiveness now understood through our knowledge of salt's ability to create an osmotic effect that draws fluid from swollen tissue, reducing inflammation through a genuine, scientifically explicable mechanism. Even though ancient Mesopotamian healers arrived at this same practical solution through nothing more than patient, accumulated observation across countless generations of trial and experience. Similarly, consider the various plant-based remedies we discussed throughout our journey tonight, particularly those containing compounds we now understand to possess genuine antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. Myrrh, that valuable resin traded across such vast distances to reach Mesopotamian physicians, continues appearing within modern mouth, rinses, and dental preparations even today, its genuine antiseptic properties now understood through modern chemical analysis, representing a direct, unbroken thread of practical medical knowledge stretching from ancient Mesopotamian physicians all the way to contemporary dental product formulation. Willow family plants, containing compounds related to salicylic acid, eventually led, through centuries of continued refinement and eventual industrial chemical synthesis, to the development of aspirin itself, one of the most widely used pain relief medications in modern history, a direct conceptual descendant of remedies ancient Mesopotamian physicians employed to ease exactly the kind of dental pain we've explored so thoroughly throughout our journey together tonight. Even the more dramatic interventions we discussed, the surgical lancing of dental abscesses to relieve dangerous pressure and infection, represents a direct conceptual ancestor of modern dental procedures, since contemporary dentistry continues employing remarkably similar fundamental principles when treating severe dental abscesses today, creating incisions to allow infected material to drain, though now performed with vastly more sophisticated instruments, genuine anesthesia, and, crucially, antibiotic treatment to address the underlying bacterial infection in ways completely unavailable to ancient Mesopotamian physicians who could relieve the immediate pressure and pain of an abscess but could not address the underlying infection with anything approaching the effectiveness modern antibiotics provide. We might also consider, as we begin drawing our long journey tonight toward its gentle conclusion, The broader philosophical and psychological legacy left by ancient Mesopotamian approaches to dental suffering, the holistic integration of physical treatment with spiritual and psychological support that we explored so thoroughly when discussing the role of priests, temples, and ritual incantation alongside more practical herbal and surgical interventions. While modern medicine has in many respects moved toward increasingly specialized, technically focused treatment approaches, there has also been, particularly in recent decades, a genuine renewed appreciation with contemporary healthcare for the psychological and emotional dimensions of physical suffering. Recognition that addressing a patient's anxiety, fear, and emotional distress alongside purely physical treatment can genuinely improve outcomes and patient experience, echoing, in some ways, that ancient Mesopotamian understanding that treating the whole person, body, and spirit together often proved more effective and more genuinely compassionate than addressing physical symptoms in complete isolation. As we reach this final stretch of our long, unhurried journey together tonight, let us take a moment to reflect on the deeper meaning woven throughout everything we've explored across these many hours. The ancient Sumerian farmer lying awake, believing a worm gnawed at his aching tooth. The careful ritual performed by priests within candlelit temple chambers. The methodical Babylonian physician lancing an abscess according to principles codified within Hammurabi's great legal code. The far-traveling merchant caravans carrying myrrh and medical knowledge across vast desert distances, connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt and beyond. The dedicated scribes of Ashurbanipal's library preserving accumulated centuries of medical wisdom against the ravages of time and eventual imperial collapse. The ordinary farmers and craftspeople enduring decades of gradual dental wear from stone-flecked barley bread, teaching their children to clean their teeth with simple frayed twigs at the end of each long day. Every single one of these ancient people, whether kings or farmers, priests or scribes, wealthy merchants or humble laborers, shared something fundamentally, universally human with each of us listening tonight: the experience of physical pain, the search for relief and understanding, the quiet comfort found in community, in ritual, in the simple presence of another person tending carefully to our suffering. Across nearly 4,000 years of separation, across languages long since fallen silent, across entire civilizations that rose to magnificent heights and eventually crumbled back into dust and memory, this fundamental thread of human experience remains remarkably, movingly constant: the shared vulnerability of our physical bodies, the persistent ache of an infected tooth, and the equally persistent human impulse to seek comfort, to develop remedies, to sit beside each other through pain, and offer whatever relief and reassurance remains within our power to provide. As you rest here now, deep within the quiet stillness of your own night, so very far removed in time and place from the ancient world we've explored together across these many hours, consider how many countless generations of human beings have lain awake, just as you might be lying awake right now, feeling their own bodies, their own small aches and discomforts, finding whatever comfort they could within their own particular moment in history. The ancient Mesopotamian farmer applying a beer and herb poultice to his aching jaw beneath flickering oil lamplight. The worried mother in Babylon watching a physician carefully lance her child's swollen gum. The palace scribe in Nineveh consulting ancient medical texts by the light of his own careful lamp, searching for guidance to ease his own persistent dental pain. Each of them in their own time, in their own way, seeking exactly the same fundamental relief and comfort that you yourself might be seeking right now as you drift towards sleep. Let this long, ancient history settle over you now like a warm and gentle weight. Let every detail we've explored together tonight, the tooth worms and temple rituals, the Babylonian courtrooms and Assyrian libraries, the trade caravans and archaeological discoveries, blur softly together into a single, unified feeling of connection. Connection across time, connection across culture, connection across the simple, universal experience of being human, of suffering, and of caring for each other through that suffering, with whatever tools, whatever knowledge, whatever compassion each era of history has been able to provide. You do not need to remember any specific detail from our long journey together tonight. You do not need to hold on to any particular fact or story. All you need to do now is rest. Let your breathing slow further. Let your body sink more deeply into whatever soft surface currently holds you, and allow yourself to drift slowly and completely into peaceful, restorative sleep, carried gently by the quiet, ancient rhythm of this long history we've shared together. A history that reminds us, more than anything else, that we have never truly been alone in our suffering, that countless generations before us have faced these same simple human struggles and found their way eventually, always, back to rest. Sleep well now. Let the ancient world fade quietly into the darkness behind your closed eyes. This story and all its gentle history will still be here whenever you need it again.